won more than a dozen major journalism awards, including his 1970 Pulitzer Prize for uncovering the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He wrote for the New York Times from 1972 to 1979 until his resignation to begin his bestseller, The Price of Power, a highly acclaimed expose of foreign policy scandals during the Nixon-Kissinger administration. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Seymour Hersh.
I'll say, if you can't hear, holler. The mic seems fine. Great. Sometimes I tend to mumble. What I thought I'd do is tell you what's on my mind, and we'll entertain some questions, and I guess I ought to begin, and I think we could probably have a conversation, if we want, afterwards, just in terms of any ideas you have. I ought to begin by just bringing you greetings from Washington, where the first acting president of the United States has had a couple of great box office weeks. I guess they call it BO out here. I don't know who he's playing, Wayne or what. But for those of you who don't know, haven't been listening to the newspapers, it is true that American forces did successfully invade Luxembourg this morning, and we'll be in Monaco by evening, and perhaps the Seychelles next week. And there won't be any country under 125,000 that'll be safe from American forces, I guess. I come from a long line of in my reporting, I come from basically a very simple position of morality. It seems sort of Pollyannish. I am a moralist, and I'm always baffled by this incredible contradiction in our society, which is that all of us place, as in all societies, we all place such a high value on integrity and honesty in our relationships. We don't want our children to lie. As children, we don't want to lie to our parents. And in any long-standing relationship we have, we all value, again, the same basic notions of integrity and honesty, and yet we don't seem to place the same burden on the men at the very top in our government. It's sort of a great mystery to me. I don't know why we don't ask as much of the men at the top as we do of our own children. And I'll leave it to some of you to figure out what some of the problems are. I just do know that, and how to get around. I'm very good at pointing out problems, not very good at solutions. One way I look at it is I can't tell you how many people have come up to me since my book was published and said, "Oh, come on, Cy, for God's sakes. So what if he cut a few corners? So what if he told some lies? You know, it's an immoral world and we have to operate immorally." And this is the standard sort of gambit. I think we all understand what Reagan's really doing. Reagan's really telling us, I think, in a rather honest way, that if the Russians are allowed to operate in their sphere of influence, what we concede to be their sphere of influence, Afghanistan, Czechoslovakia, what are we having a fight back there? If they're allowed to operate, anyway, the point is if the Russians are allowed to operate Poland, for example, we too have the right to operate in our sphere of influence. And I think it's as simple as that. If Russia wants to call the attempts of Poland and the activities in Poland to, the way the Russians described their takeover in Poland was to denounce counter-revolutionaries in Warsaw, fueled by the CIA. Would be that the CIA could be so good. I think a perfectly apt analogy or parallel would be the Reagan administration's insistence on describing what's going on in Nicaragua as being fueled by the KGB. I think both cases you have the same sort of cynical approach, and I think it works very closely. It's a certain symmetry. I don't think most Americans want to accept it. I think if you look at the world today, this notion of fighting immorality with immorality, you have to look at where we are right now. We are in Central America in a big way, obviously. Largest army there is the CIA. I'm sure you all know that. Grenada, of course. We're going to have a long occupation there. And we will find out, too, eventually what all of the issues were there. I'm sure everybody accepts the fact that we don't really know what the issues were that behind the invasion yet. We have American forces in Beirut, where the Muslims and the Christians, as I.F. Stone pointed out the other week, have been after each other, fighting each other viciously for 13 centuries, which is roughly 12 and a half centuries before the Russian Revolution. So if Reagan wants to insist that it's all basically the fault of the commies through the Syrians, I think he's misreading history pretty severely. We have in Iran and Iraq another potential area of conflict. The United States has a flotilla probably there by now, Marines and another carrier. There's threats to stop the straits there through which most of the supertanker oil, or supertankers laden with oil, come through. And Reagan has said if there's any serious attempts to block that passage, we will get active. We've just withdrawn some troops who were on patrol off the northern coast of Japan looking for the remains of the downed Korean airliner. All of these are major events. Central America, Grenada, Beirut, farther in the Middle East, Iran and Iraq will also be a big story before they're done with it. If they weren't going on, we'd have some incredible crises to face. That would be dominating the news. I think the dispute between North and South Korea is far more serious. Again, it's a chronic problem. The assassination of a number of South Korean officials is going to do nothing to help the situation there. When I used to look at these things 10 years ago, I was into nuclear war planning for a little while. At that time, the planners, the men in the military and State Department who thought about such things, and the think tank people, they would generally pick North and South Korea as the most logical place for a nuclear war, nuclear device, the use of a nuclear device. And I don't think I'm out of line by telling you that I guess most people now who also currently think about these issues no longer talk in terms of when the bomb's going to go off, but what's the secondary issue. I mean, we're talking inside a 10-year framework. The great tragedy, of course, is that the invasion of Grenada does so much to further atrophy our moral standing in the world. We really lose the right to tell anybody what else to do. We really can't tell Gaddafi now that his view of what is important in invading Chad and is not isn't shared by us. We've lost so much cachet, and we lose the cachet to lean on all of these third world nations with emerging nuclear armed forces. I do think you ought to know that if you don't, that getting back to the nuclear weapons, one theory is if the weapon goes off, as most people think it will, inevitably, combinations and permutations, whatever kind of war games they do mathematically. If it gets off in the southern cone, we'll be all right because the fallout will just be in, Africa and Latin America and Australia, and that's okay. If it's here, apparently the currents is such that we won't get much fallout. If it's up north in this hemisphere, I guess it's going to be whether or not either the United States or the Soviet Union will think in the next hour or two after the incident whether their manhood's been challenged effectively or in such a way that they have to respond. And if they do, of course, it's the end of civilization. I think it's as simple as that. I think it's one of the reasons that I'm totally for the freeze movement, having been somewhat concerned about the practicality of it, but forget it. The fact is the freeze movement is an expression of all sorts of people in America, that the whole business of nuclear disarmament is too important to be left to governments. The old joke about armed war too important to be left to generals has been changed now. We're not going to get nuclear disarmament if we leave it to governments. I think it's very clear. Again, if we hadn't had all of these other crises, as I said, North and South Korea would be a big issue. We'd also be looking very hard, I think more avidly, at the Philippines, where Mr. Marcos's sort of true colors were demonstrated to a lot of his opposition when he had, or indirectly or whatever, there's no evidence yet, but I think we'll find some, that the assassination of Aquino in August was related somehow to Mr. Marcos directly or his wife or to their allies. And what you're going to see in the Philippines is this. You're seeing a growing insurgency movement right now. You're going to see Marcos calling them lefties and communists. The United States will intervene, of course, on the side of Marcos, since we have a lot of bases there to protect. We will begin counter-revolutionary activities against the people in the jungles there or whatever. We will eventually do what we've done so many other places, in Vietnam most notably, drive a group of nationalists to the left, make good little commies if that's what we want to do. I guess the the wish, or whatever the cliche you want, the wish will father the thought, or whatever, the action anyway, we'll end up having a pretty serious left-wing insurgency there. And of course, we'll be on the wrong side. And anybody that doesn't think it's going to work that way is just not looking at history. It's going to work that way. We are now trying to install the Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, basically in Italy, West Germany, and England. That's going to cause a lot more disarray, whether they go in or not. And by the way, one of the consequences of moving the missiles there, of course, is theoretically, we reduce the amount of warning from a land-based missile from around 15 minutes that you have from the missiles in Montana, elsewhere in the Rockies, to the Soviet Union, about a 15-minute drop. When you get strategic missiles in Western Europe, you're talking 3 to 6 minutes. And the Soviets will respond in the only way that makes sense. They will park their submarines outside of harbors in New York, Savannah, Georgia, Florida, San Francisco, Long Beach. They will simply park them there. And we will have a new issue next year at some point, the Soviet threat from off our shores. I mean, what else can they do? I don't think we leave them much options. NATO, of course, is in its chronic disarray, but that's so boring. That seems to always work out or not work out. But that's also an issue. I mean, I do think even the West Germans, Mr. Kohl's government, is having a great deal of problems with the Reagan administration, a lot more than you might understand from reading in the newspapers. We now have the aftermath of the Korean airliner incident, which was manipulated, I think everybody now understands, very dramatically by the Reagan administration, looking for some votes on the MX and others. Quick hit at the commies. If anybody doesn't understand, let me tell you that one of the great things about military men is if they're told that they're attacking a spy plane, it doesn't matter what the plane. They could have had Bambi and Snow White and the dwarfs dancing on the wings. They just would have thought of what a clever disguise and blown it out of the sky. If anybody doesn't think a Soviet Aeroflot liner going off base over Camp David, ignoring wigwags to go down and ignoring cannon fire in front of it and continuing on a path that would take it over to the Nevada test site, if anybody doesn't think we'd do anything else, forget it. We would. Of course we would. Not that what was done was so wonderful, but it wasn't quite the irrational act that was depicted. It ended up being, with the American-Soviet relations, at the lowest point, 15 years, which is very scary in terms of, I think, the burgeoning nuclear devices all over the world. I think for us not have any sort of connection with those, more of a relaxed atmosphere, is very, very distressing. Okay, all these things I've described today, Central America, Grenada, Beirut, Iran, North and South Korea, the Philippines, the Pershing IIs, the disarray in NATO, the Korean shootdown, the decline in détente, if that Kissinger word can be used, U.S.-Soviet relations. All this is the product of the great notion of fighting immorality with immorality. I suggest to you that you couldn't do much worse trying anything else. And I also suggest to you that maybe we should start looking at the character of the men that we elect a little more. And since basically we're always buying the same policy anyway, does anybody seriously think that Walter Mondale or whatever wimp wins the Democratic nomination is going to have the guts to do much different except for Jesse Jackson, who's probably the best thing that's been happening to the Democrats. Going to move him someplace. Does anybody think our policy is going to be much different? I don't. I think basically, I'm talking about foreign policy, not domestic policy. There's a distinct difference. I think basically we have to understand that we're going to have to look, the bottom line is going to have to be character. Since the system isn't really producing the kind of diversity it has to, and since we're not in the process of trying to prepare or repair or alter the system, our presidential appointment system, our whole process, let's start thinking about character. And I would argue that if we got somebody who was willing to be a little more honest and open about what our foreign policy objectives were, I think in the long run we would really be better off. I don't think we could be much worse off, is all I'm really saying. This is not a happy. I think a lot of us have a lot of misunderstandings about the press's function and how it performs. And the obvious conclusion is that I'm raising grave questions about the quality of information you get, profound questions. And I'm talking about across the board. I do think that and I will take the time, if you have it, I'll describe Woodward and Bernstein have become synonymous with Redford and Hoffman. All the President's Men is still on TV rerun. So Watergate emerges as a great success story. Let me give you my account of. I can't tell you how much journalism school enrollment jumped in the 5 or so years after the bad Nixon was the man who we read the White House tape recordings, we watched him on television. Criminal, of course, but diffuse, vague, unfocused, spending most of it with a note that the Italians have devaluated the lira, and Kissinger and Nixon says rather, sneak division that led to Super K, maybe this a psychological need by the country to have somebody good. I would say it's more than Leach, has to inevitably to infect the other side. For those who don't remember, don't know, he was a refugee from Nazi Germany, came over here in the late 30s, read his works carefully. By no means was he singularly brilliant in terms of his position than he was, but nonetheless, he was competent. His great instinct, his great facility, it seems to me, was his almost natural inclination as a psychoanalyst. He's an incredible empathy. He could read an audience better. He can read the press better. He can read the particular person he's trying to work on and flatter better than most people. That's an incredibly good skill he has. I have no idea, maybe having to ingratiate yourself. I can't even begin to understand where he got it, but I guess growing up in Germany must have been very tense. You must have had an awful lot of confrontations with people that you were afraid of, that you had to work around. I just don't know on what basis. I can't begin to guess at where he got this incredible skill at this Janus face. Anyway, in 68, by 68, part of the genius is this. Everybody at Harvard wants to make it. In the 50s, they have these little sherries with people like Rockefeller coming up and having a sip of wine with the faculty, and they all do that. They all go and grab at his coattails, Rocky's, and it's Kissinger who made it became sort of important to Rockefeller. Was his foreign policy advisor in '64 when he ran for president and lost the nomination, Republican nomination, lost to Barry Goldwater. In '68, Nixon was the winner when Rockefeller ran again for the nomination, losing to Nixon in Miami Beach in August. Nixon, of course, had been Ike's vice president from 52 to 60, lost to Jack Kennedy by a few votes, probably stolen from him in Chicago, but he did nothing about it, to his credit. 62, he loses again. He was running for the presidency in 60. In 62, he runs for the governorship of California, loses to Pat Brown, announces he's out of it, tells the newspaperman, you won't have me to kick around anymore. 68, he ends up defeating Rockefeller. Kissinger's enraged at the loss, so I presume Rockefeller was too. Tells a number of people, Kissinger does, how much he dislikes Nixon, how he can't stand him. Goes off to sulk at Harvard or wherever. We now know Humphrey emerges as a Democratic candidate, and this is important. Humphrey's only there because Lyndon Johnson, who had taken over the Vietnam War from Jack Kennedy, and don't think Jack Kennedy would have stopped that war. I would suggest to you the most outrageous propagandizing I've seen has been the Sorensen Schlesinger books. If you go back and reread them, a little less starstruck now. Jack Kennedy gave us a lot of good things, but he also gave us nation-building, counterinsurgency, fortified Hamlet, strategic Hamlet, Green Berets. He gave us a lot of things. He wasn't going to back out in Vietnam. Johnson wasn't going to either. And in 68, he was confronted with a growing anti-war demonstration. I was G. McCarthy's press secretary in 68. I remember coming here in January of 68 for a speech here. Johnson, faced with dissent inside his own party, went belly up. He had a choice. He could have done something conciliatory on Vietnam to please the anti-war people and won renomination, but he went belly up. He wouldn't do it. Humphrey takes the mantle. It's Humphrey versus Nixon in the fall of 68 for the presidency after Labor Day. Second week of the campaign. Kissinger's out of it. He does two extraordinary acts, neither of which were publicly known until I wrote my book, which is one of the big focal points of this summer of my book. Big controversy, but they're worth telling you the way I would like to tell them, which is this. In the second week of September, Kissinger approaches the Humphrey people. He's got two conditions. He tells the Humphrey people, Zbigniew Brzezinski is the man he's seeing, an academic, the foreign policy advisor. I sometimes feel I ought to enunciate a new rule that nobody of Eastern European descent can be national security advisor. It's not very generous, and it's probably racist and all that. But nonetheless, Brzezinski was there, and Kissinger approaches him with two conditions on the meeting. One, nobody's to know about it except Humphrey, who's to be personally told. He offers to make available to the Humphrey forces Rockefeller's private personal file on Richard Nixon, a dirty file. He calls it a shit file, to be honest. So Brzezinski recalled. And Nixon, I don't have to tell you, is as wacky as they come, right? He is. We all know that. And there's a lot of stuff. Believe me, I know some of it. It's really awful. And it would have been handy to have. Look, I'm not very unsparing, and I kept it out of my book. I'm serious. There is stuff. And the notion that emerged, anyway, it's serious stuff. The notion that emerged that it was just a compilation of speeches. Anyway, he offers to turn over the Rockefeller file to the Humphrey camp. There's elation in the Humphrey camp. Humphrey later tells a number of his senior aides, among them Max Campbell and people close to him, right before the election, Humphrey always was behind Nixon in the election and never thought about his cabinet or his government makeup. But he did say that it wasn't going to be Brzezinski, it was going to be Kissinger for National Security Advisor, which was very surprising. The same week he approaches the Humphrey camp, Kissinger approaches Richard V. Allen in private, the Nixon foreign policy advisor, who later shows up as foreign policy national security advisor to Reagan, just as Brzezinski, of course, became Carter's national security advisor. Allen, an ideologue, conservative, the same conditions. Allen is to tell nobody about it except Nixon personally, and he offers to talk on Vietnam to them. And what Allen knows, and you and I did not back in '68, was that Kissinger had become by '65 a major player in the inside processes of the Vietnam peace talks. In '65, he'd gone to Vietnam, initially at the insistence of Henry Cabot Lodge, the Republican ambassador who had been appointed by Kennedy, and did some work on pacification. He stayed over as other ambassadors served. He made 3 trips to Vietnam in '65 and '66. In '67, Kissinger became involved, we now know from the Pentagon Papers, in a highly sensitive series of secret negotiations on the Vietnam War in the summer or fall of '67. He made 4 trips to Paris from Washington and Boston on behalf of the Johnson administration. He was given an office in the State Department. He was working directly with the President, Lyndon Johnson, working directly with the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and working directly with Averell Harriman, the chief delegate to the peace talks. He behaved impeccably. The talks didn't work. The issue was somehow to find a formula to end the bombing of the North in return for a full-scale convening of the peace, all the parties to the peace process in Paris. They didn't work. But Kissinger really endeared himself to people because all during the '68 campaign, when Rockefeller was slugging out on a number of issues, there was no sign that Kissinger had tipped off Rocky or they made any overt use of that information in the campaign. You can't get anything higher accolade. This guy clearly understood a serious negotiation. In September the 12th, that's the date, Kissinger goes to Allen and he offers to start dealing with them on Vietnam. He understands, as does Nixon, that the whole election is going to hang on whether or not Johnson can get Nguyen Van Thu, the president of South Vietnam, to settle for a peace offer, and whether he can work out something with the North Vietnamese. Something was worked out, and by the end of by September the 19th, Kissinger is in Paris, paying his own way on the SS France, and sees everybody, and learns that indeed there had been a breakthrough. The government of the United States and the government of North Vietnam had worked out a formula for ending the bombing and going to the peace talks. There were there were a lot of modalities, is the word they use, a lot of things to be negotiated. Johnson wanted to play politics with it. He wanted to make it public as close to the election as he could. But Kissinger began talking to the Nixon people about it, not only to Allen, but he later established a separate connection to John Mitchell, then the campaign manager, later the Attorney General, infamous Attorney General, who's much brighter than you might think, but also not with an awful lot of honor. I talked to him an awful lot and used very little of it on grounds that he just was, convicted, just was too close to Nixon. But anyway. He talked about this and acknowledged that this was a very big issue for them, to get Henry Kissinger telling what's going on in the peace talks. Johnson, we later know from the published memoirs that Johnson went bananas when he learned that Nixon had found out the secret. He ordered the FBI, the CIA, and the National Security Agency, which monitors overseas communications, to get on their case and find out everything they could about what's going on with Nixon. They found 2 instances in the next month. This is about 6 weeks before the election. Between 6 weeks and 2 weeks before the election, 2 instances where people close to Nixon, not Nixon, got in touch with Nguyen Van Thu and told him to lay off. Don't take anything the Democrats give you, sabotage the peace offer, and go for it with Nixon. He's going to do more for you. I wish I could tell you there's a direct line between Kissinger's interference. Kissinger, by the way, made 4 or 5 telephone calls to Allen and to Mitchell, all during this period. In one case, they actually spoke German together. Allen was fluent in German. Kissinger was in a payphone in Paris and was nervous about being overheard. There is no direct line, however. between Kissinger's interference and the failure of the bombing halt to work and the failure of the peace talks to begin and the activities of Win Van to sabotage it and the continuation of the war for 7 more years. There is no direct line because you can't prove that Win Van Tu needed Nixon, Kissinger, anybody to tell him who to support or whether to sabotage a peace offer. He didn't have to be told. You can say this about Kissinger, though. He intervened as a man who'd been active in the peace process, looking for a job. He intervened in the 2 months of 5 years that Lyndon Johnson was willing to talk peace in Vietnam. For 2 months and 5 years, September and October, to elect as vice president, Johnson was willing to make some concessions, and Kissinger intervenes then, looking for a job against the peace process. If it didn't lead to a direct connection, and there is no evidence it did, it wasn't for want of trying. Let's put it that way. And Nixon understood. You understand that everybody understands without ever saying anything in this level. Nixon started telling people in his own administration, among them Allen, Peter Flanagan, later an economic advisor, Joseph Kraft, a syndicated columnist. Nixon tells them all that he's going to pick Kissinger, although he's hardly met Kissinger. Look, let me get something straight, just so we understand. This is empirical stuff. I've been a reporter too long not to know. It's empirical. We can't argue about this. Kissinger called it a pack of lies, but everybody acknowledged it was true. How significant it is remains for some other histories to be done. We don't know. This is what got his job, nothing else. That he was willing to betray the Democrats for Nixon. This is what, and the two guys, Nixon did understand a kindred soul when he saw it. Took him in right away. They get into office. Now, here's where it gets here again, I'm telling you things that are different. You have to, this is a necessary fact. This is what I think. This is my conclusion. I'm not going to suggest that there's any hard evidence for this. Maybe we'll get the White House tape recordings and maybe it'll come out. But here's their situation. Among the things we do know is that the first thing Nixon and Kissinger did upon getting elected into office was they grabbed all the power. They seized all the power from the bureaucracy. They understood that they were going to control it all in the White House. Nixon had an incredible genius. Let's face it, I don't like him. He's very diabolical, but he had a genius. He had an insight. And he understood he could buy his way into the Russians and the Chinese. He understood that he could find a way into them. In the case of the Russians, it was wheat. He ended up dealing more than $1 billion worth of wheat and loaning them the money at 6% interest to buy it. In the case of the Chinese, it was really nothing more than his willingness to go 12,000 miles to bow and scrape at the feet of Mao at the Forbidden Palace, Heavenly Palace, at a time when China was nowhere near the world power the rest of us thought it was, largely because of the problems it had with the Red Guards. China at that point was in trouble militarily, socially, economically. The party was in shambles. Nonetheless, Nixon made him a great power. It's a considerable thing the Chinese needed out of that. Nixon understood that. I don't know whether he articulated. I don't know if he understood it about getting into office or whether he did right away or whether it came to him in the first or second year. And here's the important thing about that. He also understood that he and Kissinger both understood they never wanted to see the communist flag fly in South Vietnam. They never wanted to lose the war. The policy was not the policy as enunciated within 6 months of the Nixon-Kissinger administration was this: we're winding down. That was Kissinger's word to everybody. We're bringing it to a halt with withdrawing the boys, part of something called the Vietnamization process. We're going to bring home the boys. We're going to increase the training for the South Vietnamese, and in the end, there'll be a decent interval. The two sides will square off, and may the best man win. That never was the real policy. The real policy, that was all designed for one thing. You're looking for re-election, and you can't go ahead and start getting tough in Vietnam and win re-election unless you can do one or two other things. You can mute the anti-war demonstration by announcing a Vietnamization, a program that a policy that you don't really mean. And secondly, you can have summits in Russia and China. You can arrange the world's events in such a way that in February 1972, Nixon did go to Peking with full satellite coverage. Don't forget the Chinese with their secretness had a way. That was one of the prices the Chinese had to pay to allow satellite coverage in their network coverage. We had Nixon for breakfast every day. And then in May, Nixon goes to Moscow for the SALT talks, 3 weeks before the Democratic nomination, which is worthless at that time. He's allowing the Russians and the Chinese to re-elect him He's allowing the Russians and the Chinese to have him described as a man of peace. At the same time, he's got a free hand in Vietnam. He can win re-election and still carry out the war. This is not bad stuff. This is very, very shrewd politicking. And a major, I mean, you can't underestimate it. The message is, how do you tell the public you're winding down, and how do you tell the other side we want to get tough? And the first thing they decide to do is in the spring of '69, they decide to escalate the war in Cambodia. Cambodia had been a neutral country, Prince Sihanouk. It had been used, portions of it had been used adjacent to South Vietnam as a staging ground for the communist troops. The North Vietnamese and Vietnamese communists would hit at the American troops, and the South Vietnamese in South Vietnam pull back to Cambodia. The argument was, let's start taking them out, let's hit them directly. And by the way, let me say, I think a president has a right, if he so chooses, a newly elected president, to begin bombing any, if he wants to bomb as a condition for saving the American forces and winning the war, regardless of what I think about it, he has a right to do it. I'm not taking issue with that. I'm taking issue with the fact that he decided to do it and not tell anybody about it. That's where I'm into him. That's a very significant departure from previous practice. And by the way, everybody inside told him not to do it. There was it wasn't a question of it was just everybody said, if you start bombing all of the advisors, you're going to drive the communists further into Cambodia and threaten Sihanouk and eventually have a war there. But that they didn't care about that. They wanted to do the bombing. They began bombing in secret March 16, 1969, using the B-52s. The bombing was done so secretly, there was a double bookkeeping system kept. The B-52 bombers, the pilots and bombardiers would get targets in Cambodia, drop the bombs, and then come back and falsify the records, debrief them falsely. In other words, brief them to their intelligence officers of being in South Vietnam. It was done by the White House. We're talking about 3,630 missions, over 100 heavy bombing. Amazing sort of bombing. In May, the New York Times writes a story, Bill Beecher, as we're going to put B-52 bombs in Cambodia. Beecher doesn't know that it's falsely reported, doesn't know that it's, in fact, by late summer, Kissinger's personally picking the targets. It's fun stuff. Wiretapping begins, some of them, among them Beecher. Within 2 weeks, the FBI, which is very nervous about this wiretapping, it comes directly to us, hey, we're not finding anything. These guys aren't leakers. It doesn't matter. 4 men are wiretapped that are new. Joan Kennedy, personal friend who would call every night talking about her long-standing soap opera with Ted Kennedy, would read what his aides thought about him, what they were telling other newspapermen. The taps were on Freddie Defense or William Rogers, the Secretary of State, who were really the most feared men in the administration. Not because, hero of my book, Laird was against the Vietnam War. Laird, the guy I remember from the New York, instead of a snout, a B-52 bomber, for 4 years he allowed him on the war. They're cut out of much of this stuff, by the way. Nixon and Kissinger didn't have the guts to tap their own cabinet members, but they tapped the men close. A Harvard professor close to Kissinger, very bright. In July, August of '69, he leaves the defense, and a number of men, Averell Harriman, he helps him write articles against the war, and eventually he joins the eventual '72 campaign. The tap on Halperin is to be kept on at all costs. Scripts are to be kept. Among the things that's astonishing about it, well, let me tell you one of them. He had a wife named Mrs. Halperin, became, like a lot of people in Washington at that time, convinced her phone was being tapped, wiretaps by people in the government. For this book, with the condition that anything I would try not to use anything. In this case, I got permission to use a couple lines. One conversation, late '69. Here's the FBI taking it down verbatim, remember. Nixon wanted it verbatim on Halperin. The tap goes till February 7th. Beeping, she says to her mother-in-law. At this point in the transcript, the FBI agent monitoring it, being on the line, Ina has a complex. Her phone is being tapped. In the spring of '70, Nixon invades Cambodia on the ground. If you remember that, the Kent State intrusion, 4 students are shot at Kent State. Nixon goes on television to explain it. He tells the American people, obviously, bad summer for Nixon. Let me wrap this up. Bad summer for Nixon, '70. That it's nominees since Eisenhower lost Lewis Strauss, the Secretary of Commerce, in '59. In late summer, he authorizes the CIA to begin a full-scale domestic operation against his anti-war critics and against American black radicals in the States, in total violation of all standing orders and violations and understandings of the CIA operations. Johnson had the CIA do some domestic stuff, but Nixon orders them to go full scale. 50 men or more agents are running nets. We never will know the full scope of this. It was codenamed Project Chaos, of all things. It was investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee, but they relied on the CIA for the evidence. That's a hopeless situation. Later that summer, Salvador Allende stuns the White House by winning election. He's a Marxist socialist. He wins the popular election. There's three candidates. The CIA's man, Alessandri, loses despite all the money we threw in. Allende wins, and Allende is public enemy number one for Nixon for quite a while. Let me tell you why. It's the end of summer. It's been a lousy summer. He's got the war going nowhere. He's had no breakthroughs yet. He's got no sign of the Chinese coming around on a summit or the Russians. He can't get it going. His great plan, the plan doesn't seem to be working. Although most of the public doesn't know what he's really doing, it still is. He's being blown away. He knows he's going to do badly in the fall congressional elections, and he's worried, as he says in his memoirs, about re-election. Allende had promised to nationalize 51% of the American corporations working down there. One of the companies down there, Anaconda Copper, had a mine that made $500 million in profits between 1960 and 1970. The ITT asset down there, the phone company, Chiltelco, was making enormous profits on a small capital investment. Nixon orders the CIA to kill Allende if possible, assassinate him. Secondly, if they can't do that, make it overthrow him by force if possible, stage a military coup. If they can't do that, make it impossible for him to govern and get him eventually. The wrong question has always been asked about Allende. I really spent a lot of time on this. I don't know, 40,000 words here. The wrong question's been asked. I got inside the operation through a fluke. I got into one of the guys who was down there with the mission to hit him, understood it was not national security but corporate security at stake, and so did most of the CIA station, but of course they kept their mouths shut. The question that's always asked is this. In September 1973, Allende was murdered and overthrown. Was the CIA involved that day or that week or that month? The answer, of course, as far as we know, is no. Wrong question. The question should be, what did the CIA do between 1970 and 1973 when he was overthrown to make it impossible for him to overcome the very real political and economic problems he had? He might not have done it anyway. There was always a lot of problems in that country. The answer is we'll never know. Nixon's involvement was only because the head of Anaconda, Jay Parkinson of New York, and the head of ITT, Harold Janine, had put a lot of money in 68, and he wanted to make sure they were coming through in 72. That's speculation. I don't have it hard. I don't think there's any other conclusion to draw from the operation. It was not national security. There's CIA reports saying our national interest is not at stake. It's really a low point for a president. In secret, 71, Ellsberg puts out the Pentagon Papers. Full court press against Ellsberg, Nixon and Kissinger. Kissinger's upset because he had brought Ellsberg's a genius on Vietnam, and he brought Ellsberg in as a consultant in the first 6 weeks of his administration. Here's Ellsberg in the Nixon White House working away, typing papers on Vietnam. Then he goes out and leaks it. I think Kissinger's fear was a reflection on his judgment. I don't know. The White House plumbers are set up. G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt. They break into Kissinger, to the office of Ellsberg psychoanalyst here in Beverly Hills in September, over Labor Day 1971, with impunity. Liddy tells a stewardess on one of their trips, we know this from grand jury proceedings, that he and Hunt were higher than they were higher than the FBI and the CIA. They were in a secret White House police unit. And by the way, some of you must be interested in studying this period. The Pentagon Papers, let me again tell you why they're so important. The Pentagon Papers are important for this reason. We know how bad the language was and the fuzziness of the Nixon White House from the White House tapes. The Pentagon Papers are different people. This isn't USC. This isn't Haldeman and Chapin. This is the Harvard cream and the best and the brightest. This is John McNaughton, McGeorge Bundy et al. And the language is wonderful in the Pentagon Papers. Precise, clear. Guess what? The morality is the same. It's the same arrogance as Nixon had in terms of foreign policy. It's the same notion that the public doesn't have to be told everything and you can operate without telling the public, and you don't want to tell the public. For example, in 64, it seems clear from a reasonable reading of the papers, as Johnson is running against Barry Goldwater in the 64 campaign and denouncing Goldwater as a bomb thrower, his little brain trust, recorded in the Pentagon Papers, are busily planning the escalation of Vietnam. The problem we have in this country doesn't just go to Nixon. The problem we have is that all the presidents we've had since 61, Kennedy, Johnson, and up, have had two basic rights that we've granted them. in our society. Two sort of divine rights, King Jamesian rights. One, the right to engage American boys overseas without adequate consultation with Congress or the American people. And two, of course, the right to lie about it. That's no other question. If you don't think that's right, well, I don't know. Anyway, let me wrap this up. Let me tell you why I'm talking about all this. Hunt and Liddy had the Watergate break-in team with them, of course. Sturgis, Barker, Martinez, Gonzalez. They went into the office of Dr. Fielding here in Beverly Hills. In April 72, the same team was ordered to go into the Watergate offices of Larry O'Brien, Democratic National Headquarters, and put a bug in. They do it. In May 72, again, what I'm telling you about you don't know, but I have the documents. I got all of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force documents for this. I really had a lot of fun doing this book. I had a lot of time, 4 years. I got a lot of stuff. And those documents show that in May of 72, the same team, Hunt, Liddy et al., were authorized by Nixon through Colson to hit Ellsberg at an anti-war rally in Washington. He wasn't to be murdered. He was to be damaged, incapacitated. It's not clear. Break a leg or an arm. There's testimony to the Watergate people about this. No charges were ever filed about this for a couple of reasons. One, the people involved, Colson and others, had already pleaded guilty to constitutional crimes against Ellsberg. And the others were all caught up in Watergate. So the Watergate prosecution force dropped this stuff. In June, a month later, the Watergate team is told to go again into the Plumbers team is told to go again into the Watergate offices of Larry O'Brien because the bug hadn't worked, to put a new one in. They're caught. The Washington Post gets on the story. It begins unraveling. The cover-up payments start, et cetera, et cetera. Nixon starts reeling. I can't tell you this happened. Again, this is not hard, but anybody who's been involved in Watergate will tell you that at some point we're going to get a White House tape recording that's going to show Bob Haldeman going in June 72 to Nixon and saying, with his long yellow pad, there's things to check off and not check off, saying to the boss, oh, by the way, the plumbers have to go back in, or whatever they call them. They have to go back into Watergate, O'Brien's office. The bug isn't working. And Nixon, I guarantee you, the answer's going to be, this is a man who put 110,000 tons of bombs on a neutral country for 14 months, put the CIA to work. He's not going to hesitate twice about it. There's just no way he is. What's the whole point of this? When did we learn about the B-52 bombing of Cambodia? May 73. The wiretapping, May 73. The CIA in Chile, September 74. The CIA in domestic spying, December 74. The activities against Ellsberg, May, June, and July of 73 and later. After what? After what? I'll tell you after what. After the 72 election. It seems to me if anybody has a complaint about the press, it's George McGovern or whoever the Democrats might have nominated. Contest. Secondly, we might have had a different president. Not secondly, the same issue, I guess. The basic point is, it seems to me that Nixon might have been precluded from doing some of those things he did if he'd been caught out on the bombing or the wiretapping. He might have been more reluctant to go as far as he did. You could almost argue, and here's where I'm turning the whole notion of the press having a victory in Watergate on its head, you could almost argue that the press's inability to penetrate any of the foreign policy activities, illegal foreign policy activities, and every story I'm telling you were big stories. I mean, the B-52 bombing and the wiretapping. The B-52 bombing, for example, was the fourth item of impeachment before the House Judiciary Committee. And the first three were voted up. Nixon was impaled in the first three Watergate ones. The fourth one was defeated 26-12. But I assure you, it might have been different if they had not been able to reach consensus on the Watergate activities. There was a lot of resentment about the Cambodian bombing. Maybe not. But it was a serious issue. It seems to me that if the press had been able to penetrate any of those things, Nixon might have not have done them. And as I said, far from saving us in the case of the Nixon presidency, I think if they had been on the job, they might have prevented it. They might have been able to stop some of the activities. And if you think I'm being too hard on the press for its inability to penetrate the Nixon-Kissinger apparatus, let me take them off the hook very quickly and tell you what the real bottom line of all of this is. The bottom line of all of this is that if the White House wants to lie to the American people and the press, it can get away with it. You all right? Can you hear? I'm okay? Anyway, I don't think we have a mic. Do you have a mic? Yeah. As I said, let me just say, the bottom line is if they want to lie to the American people, they can get away with it. That's really the story. I'm going to take the press off the hook totally. There's no way we can penetrate. We couldn't penetrate the Nixon-Kissinger White House. I guarantee you we're having the same problem penetrating the Reagan White House. It's just I don't know what you do about it. I think that's one reason you better not looking for the press for salvation. If there's going to be a social revolution in this country, don't expect the press to lead it. It's not even going to know about it for 6 months. And the fact is that the answer is going to have to be is we're going to have to start being more prudent and careful about the people we elect. And maybe one of the solutions is going to be we're going to have to start paying more attention to the character, since I don't think it makes that much difference given the candidates we have necessarily on foreign policy. There's a big difference on welfare programs and other things between the Democrats and the Republicans, obviously. But on foreign policy, history has shown very little difference. Kennedy equals Nixon. And I think we're going to have to start paying more attention to it. That's the message. The message is, forget Congress too. I'll throw that in. Give them a D- for the last 30 or 40 years. Congress just failed. I think it's the vote that Congress took on the War Powers Act in connection with the 18-month extension for Reagan in Lebanon is going to go down in history as bad a vote as the 64 Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They just have failed so utterly. And the leader, O'Neill, and the others are just doing an awful job and deserve nothing but the back of our hands in terms of electoral politics. I don't think it'll happen. There we are. That's my message. Let's do some questions, and we'll get out of here. Feel free to leave, by the way. I don't need it. It's all right. Yeah. No, I'll repeat the question. It's okay. With that small of a crowd, it's okay. Well, I'll repeat the question. It's all right. We're working right here. Do I believe that there are areas... Do I believe there are areas of government which should not be penetrated by the press? I think there are some stories, that don't make good, some secrets. For example, let me say categorically, I believe in the First Amendment. I believe it's the government's job to keep it secret, my job to find it out. And I think nothing can bar me from publishing. And the fact is, the way it works in our Constitution, the way it works in this wonderful free society we have, is there's nothing between me and publication. There's nothing. There really isn't. When I was working at the New York Times in the 70s and bopping off these national security stories, a lot of that stuff about the CIA that I mentioned and the B-52 bombing and the wiretapping, I had a lot of those stories I wrote. There was nothing to prevent me from publishing it, except we would get a lot of documents, except common sense, of course. There were some items we didn't publish because we thought as responsible citizens you don't want to. And also, the real secrets don't make good stories. If the American Polaris fleet is going to be operating at 14,000 or 5,000 foot depth in this particular location and making these turns, it's a lousy story. It's probably the most important thing you could give the Russians, where to calibrate their ability to track our submarines underwater. But it's not a good story. The American Polaris fleet is going to make some right degree turns tomorrow. It's not a good story. So there's some areas by just sort of inevitability. Some of the communication intercept stuff, the NSA stuff, some of the code breaking. It seems to me not only is legitimate, but it's not a story. But I would never rule out the right for the press to obtain any information they can, if we can get it. The classic example given is the Pentagon Papers case when the judge asked the New York Times reporter, what about a troop ship moving? If a troop ship's going to leave and your newspaper learns about it tomorrow that it's going to leave, should you publish the date of its leaving, knowing that the U-boat pack's out there in the Atlantic? And the Times lawyer, I've forgotten his name, out of Yale, conceded that as one example where pre-publication censorship might be justified. And I would argue exactly the opposite. If a New York Times reporter can find out when a troop ship's going to move, maybe the other guys can too, the bad guys. If we publish it, they have to set a new date, theoretically, which we could not then learn in advance. I would argue that there's nothing should be barred to us, except there are some basic principles. We're all part of a commonweal. We're all citizens, and I think it really works very well. Would it be fair to paraphrase what I just said to be that there should be no constraints on us, the press, other than our own editorial discretion? I think that would describe the First Amendment very accurately. That happens to be the way it is, fella. That's what it is. I mean, that's what Jefferson was writing about. There's none. There ain't any. They're trying to get some. But, I doubt if even this court, I doubt if will uphold them. The fact is there are none. There's no restraints. It's our game. Yes, sir.
Mr.
Please, what was some of the good dirt about Nixon that you left out? Where did it come from, and why did you leave it out?
All right, look, I wrote a lot of stuff in my book about Nixon being a drunkard and Nixon being a racist for the simple reason I thought they impacted. His racism impacted on the policies in Africa, particularly in the Biafran War. When he understood the issues of the Biafran War and chose not to act, although many thousands of black Africans' lives were at stake. It was just not important enough for them to be concerned with. The drinking was a chronic problem because a lot of policies, Nixon was a very heavy hitter, and a lot of policies were not carefully considered, particularly after the first year. He stopped working. He was a hard worker the first year, and a lot of times he would make decisions and make calls on the basis of being enraged. The material I left up dealt with very intimate family stuff, and I wish I could say, for example, that after some family altercation, let's say, Richard Nixon was. I'm trying to put this in a way that's consistent with. I could find no evidence that whatever particular personal problems he had impacted on foreign policy, and I was writing about foreign policy. I think the racism impacted on the policy in Africa. I think the drinking impacted generally on the policy making throughout. Let me read you something. Let me read you something, just so you can get a sense. This is the gossipy part. I don't deal much in gossip. I'm not interested in gossip that much. But the most important documents in the Nixon White House were the diaries that were kept by Kissinger. And Kissinger made a terrible mistake in his first year and a half of office. He allowed a couple of guys with some ethics to get close to him. Roger Morris, a Harvard PhD, was in the Foreign Service officer. Tony Lake was a Foreign Service officer out of Princeton. Highly ethical guys who were very close to Kissinger's personal aides. Kissinger also allowed all of his aides to listen to his phone conversations, including those with Nixon, for the first year and a half. He never thought these people left him over Cambodia in the spring of '70, and they took a lot of stuff with them. And after a lot of hemming and hawing, they eventually all talked to me about it. And it wasn't so much. It's like Dick Allen. When I spent 4 years and did 1,000 interviews, and Richard Allen I saw 3 or 4 times. And on the 4th interview, he finally said to me, "I'm going to tell you, kid." He was going in the White House. He was going to work for Reagan as National Security Advisor in another couple of weeks. It was a lunch, and he finally said, "I'm going to tell you, kid, how Kissinger got his job. I've never told a story." And he's not lying about it. He's allowing me to quote him. One of the lines that you get about my book is that only disgruntled people talk to me. Hey, that's all who talks to you anyway. It's always disgruntled people. Anyway, let me just read you this. Morris and others, whom Kissinger trusted, including Anthony Lake, found themselves enthralled that they worked on Kissinger's private diary, which is transcribed and edited nearly every night. And some days Morris remember there's names attached to this. Kissinger's entries filled 15 pages, not with high-level diplomatic strategy, but with low-level gossip. Quote, we caught glimpses of Nixon, Laird, Rogers, and Kissinger in action. Nixon drank exceptionally at night, and there were many nights when you couldn't reach him at Camp David. The diary was treated as if it were the most sensitive document in the government, which it may have been, stored in an electronically wired safe in Kissinger's office along with the secret peace talks, etc., etc. Morris often listened in on Kissinger's conversation with an obviously drunken Nixon. There were many times when a cable would come in late and Henry would say there's no sense waking him up, he'd be incoherent. The young aide, frightened at the thought of a president who was not fully competent after sundown, often wondered what would happen if the Soviet Union attacked at night. Morris did not mention such things to friends outside the White House. Quote, it's hard to explain. It's a constant barrage. You go around taking it for granted that Nixon's nuts. Henry and others go around wringing their hands for the president and saying Rogers is a fag. After a while, you lose your perspective. You don't feel a sense of outrage. All the things that you think about later, the drunkenness, the wiretapping, you become a nerd to while in the White House. It isn't a matter of constant moral torment when you're there. Kissinger told his personal staff, I'll go on a little bit more than once about his first formal White House reception and his first meeting with Mrs. Nixon, naturally, as he went through the reception line. He'd been in office about 5 months. He began to praise the president lavishly, but Mrs. Nixon leaned over and interrupted him, saying, haven't you seen through him yet? I mean, you're really talking about some heavy hitters. There seems to be the NSC staff soon came to believe that the most closely held, this is Kissinger's staff, his personal staff, the most closely held secrets in the White House did not deal with CIA operatives, communications intercepts, satellite photography, but with the character of the man running the nation's government. Nixon's drinking was to be kept secret at all costs. So was his racism. There seems to have been an unrelenting stream of anti-black remarks from the president during his first years in office. In his telephone conversations with Kissinger, he repeatedly referred to blacks as niggers, jigs, and jigaboos. Some of the slurs are obviously the result of Nixon drinking bouts, but NSA aides who monitored Kissinger-Nixon telephone calls came to believe that Nixon, drunk or sober, was a racist. One theme was that Nixon had always been a racist, but did not know the correct derogatory words until he moved from California to New York in the 60s. After Nixon referred to blacks as jungle bunnies during one of his telephone talks with Kissinger in 1969, Roger Morris recalls, Kissinger whimsically explained to Morris and another staff aide who was upset about it that Nixon had seen the play Hair while in New York and gotten educated. Later I asked, it's funny how you got, Morris didn't want to talk about this until eventually one day he did, and then I went to others I'd interviewed and they all talked about it. And one day I went to Ehrlichman, who I'd seen interviewed 4 or 5 times, and I went out to Santa Fe and saw him again, and I asked him about the drinking. And he told me this about the racism first. He said the jungle bunny really wasn't from Hair. He said it was B.B. Rabosa's favorite word. B.B. Rabosa's was Nixon's big buddy. And Ehrlichman also said about the drinking, and he later, after saying it to me, decided to put it in his biography, Witness to Power, about the Nixon years. He said that he had worked with Nixon in 60 and 62 in the campaign for the presidency and the governorship of California. When Nixon asked him in 68 to work again, he said, okay, I'll do it if you promise to lay off the sauce during the campaign. Bad stuff. Bad stuff, and we didn't know any of it. And it's not just, I don't mean to be prurient about it. It does impact on policy. Should we do a couple more?
Mr. Hersh.
Seymour. He's been waiting.
Sure.
I have a question on the morality in foreign policy. And you seem to come across as a very idealistic situation in terms
Pollyanna. That's me, old Pollyanna.
And since we all live in an imperfect world, I was wondering if you take into account the realities of the situation as they occur, and you condemn the Reagan administration completely for whatever they're doing, but I wonder if that is really the case, and the morality and the idealistic point of views that you put forward are really relevant in the real world. And my second question has to do... let me just finish and then you can answer
Sure.
it. My second question has to do with the election of 1972 and the loss of George McGovern in the presidential election. And I submit to you that the Republican Party could have nominated anybody and George McGovern would not have won in that particular election. And your bias against Nixon and Kissinger is very apparent in your talk. I was just wondering what prompted you to do this?
Well, my bias is apparent. Well, let me first compliment your discernment. And it's not rhetorical, though, my bias. And let me say that I thought I did say, if I didn't say, let me say quickly that my point was that if some of the scandals had become known at the time, there might have been a different nominee. The nomination might have been worth more. You might have had Kennedy willing to take a stab at Nixon. And I don't think they could have nominated anybody. I think it was Nixon that was the man that would have been the easy winner. And in part it was due to the amazing ability of Nixon and Kissinger to oversell what they had done and also to hide much of what they had done. One example of oversell, and it gets to be a very serious oversell issue, let me just take a success story, SALT I. In SALT I, Nixon and Kissinger came back from the SALT I conference with the Soviet Union having accomplished something very solid. They banned ABM missiles, which was an issue basically left to the SALT delegation headed by Gerard Smith, a very competent man. The issue the White House was very concerned with, and the one that Nixon and Kissinger personally took on, was banning or reducing or putting caps on, mythical caps. You know, if you remember SALT I limited the land-based missiles to levels that neither side was planning to build anyway, but nonetheless it was considered progress. It was an interim agreement, an executive agreement, not for a treaty, to limit the land-based missile growth and submarine-based missile growth to limits, at least some limit. The fact that neither side planned to build it wasn't relevant. There was an agreement to cap the arms race. And one of the things Nixon and Kissinger came back and told the United States they had done is there was a great deal of intelligence inside the American government indicating that the Soviet Unions were building a new missile, SS-19, a larger missile, and it was ready to come online. They had tested it. They were ready to deploy it. Nixon and Kissinger came back and they told the American people in public and in private congressional testimony that they had worked out an agreement, a definition, to ban these missiles, categorizing them as heavy missiles, that they were banned. The Soviets could not deploy them. This was a direct and distinct and egregious lie. There had been no such agreement worked out, as everybody in the delegation understood. And nobody publicly took on the president at this time. It was right before an election. And the issue became one in which the SALT I treaty was given a great deal of additional, which was fine in terms of the ABM, was a step forward anyway. But what Nixon and Kissinger had negotiated personally was a ban on land-based missiles, a definition, a process of defining what a heavy missile and what a light missile was. They deliberately and distinctly lied to the American people about it. The legacy of this, not apparent in 72, was this: when the Soviets did begin to deploy the missiles, as they had every right to do under the agreement, they were accused of cheating. This is an accusation that still lingers today. I would argue that the overselling and the lying about the SALT I, what really was accomplished by Nixon and Kissinger in Moscow, the overselling for immediate short-range political goals, that is to keep on driving the Democrats into the hole, led to really the lack of trust in the Soviets in this country by a lot of serious people, and allegations of fraud, and also led to the inability of SALT II. SALT I did not become SALT II. It's a very, very serious charge I'm leveling. It's not just bias. It's a fact that they lied. It's a fact that the administration, people inside understood it. It's a fact they did it for political reasons. I think that's worth reporting about. As for the question of morality and immorality, that's your first question, I would simply say that we're fighting immorality with immorality, and we're doing great, aren't we?
Mr. Hersh?
Yes.
I think maybe you let the press off the hook a little too easy. Even in your talk today, you found it necessary to explain to this audience, which is probably more well-read than many, what the NSA was. Yet there's a book out on the NSA, and it's a good book, and it's Bamford's book, The Puzzle Palace, describes the incredible extensiveness of the organization, the fact that it's 10 times more highly budgeted than the CIA, and yet it's been published, and even people here don't know about it. Doesn't the press have a role, even after the fact, when something like that's published, to avoid this censorship of obscurity that happens when, because some of the stuff in that book is, if it had been known one event at a time, the stuff that Bamford wrote about, any one of those scandals would have made front page news. As a result of it being published in a lump, it ends up getting a book review. Can you comment on the role of the press in changing that? Because that's stuff that already is out.
The press's inability to learn from yesterday, or to begin to deal with a whole art form called books in terms of nonfiction is really pretty pathetic. Yes. But my point is that, I'm friendly with Noam Chomsky, who's without question one of the most brilliant theoreticians, whether you agree or disagree with him, alive. And the one thing that always amazes me is how he's constantly writing articles and showing how the press didn't do its job. He still has this sort of innocent faith in the press, and that somehow that if presented with the truth or the reality, they will behave. And it's really a sort of a naive position. I don't think it's necessarily at this point because of any economic or institutional bias in terms of big corporations owning newspapers, but that could be true in 20 years. I think right now what you have is a press that writes but doesn't read. And there's really nothing much more to say about it. It's a very, very, I shouldn't complain about it because it puts money in my pocket. But it's very sad that there's so much stuff, particularly I think the network correspondence. If that's an answer, I don't know what the answer is. The point I'm making, though, is even if the press were on its job in the first term, even though the press was trying, the power of the presidency is so enormous in this country that the press really can't penetrate. We don't have the right to ask Bill Casey to come in under subpoena and talk to us. We don't have the right, but the Senate does, and the House Intelligence Committee does, and they can tell us about it, but they choose not to. I would argue that I'm not even putting much faith in the press in terms of that. And by the way, you understand how important this was for Nixon One reason I think Nixon could begin the cover-up when his men are caught in Watergate, the real part that got Nixon down in Watergate wasn't the act itself, was the fact that he was running out bags of money, trying to cover up, convince people not to talk about it when they began blackmailing him. And he could do that absolutely convinced with impunity. Who's going to hurt him? Why didn't Nixon destroy the White House tape recordings after they were made known by Alex Butterfield in 1973? I can give you my own guess. Why bother? Is the press going to get this? Is anybody going to hurt him with this stuff? You know, I can just envision it. He's a man who'd been able to bomb a country for a year and 3 months with B-52 bombers and never get hurt in the American press. It was reported, by the way, by the other side in Paris. The communists yelled about it, just as the communists yelled about the My Lai incident. Within 6 months of My Lai, the North Vietnamese put out a full statement in Paris, and we all wrote it off as commie propaganda, I guess. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know. I assume it was. So, you know, I don't mean to I can't disillusion you, but we've got some problems. Let's do a couple more questions and we'll go home.
Hersh?
Yeah.
Mr. Hersh, one of the frightening facts as we sit here today is that the villain of your book has not chosen to retire.
Nope.
In fact, he's now the head of a presidential commission on Central America. In light of what you say in your book, do you think there is any serious possibility that Henry Kissinger will do anything else but ratify the Reagan administration's military policies, militarism, interventionism in Central America? I particularly would like you to say something about the obvious discrepancy that you note in your book between the facts as they're presented to Henry Kissinger about what was going on in Vietnam and his own acknowledgement that we could not win in Vietnam, and yet the fact that he became a major advocate of the madman theory of war, as you call it.
No, there's no question that Kissinger's function. Kissinger, you understand, is a consummate toady. He's a very safe appointment for Reagan, and his function is going to be his function is basically, his real negotiation is going to be to convince the few Democrats who might have some other opinions inside his bipartisan committee to support him, which he will do, since his ability to maneuver people is superb. His real function is to come up with a report that's going to ratify what Reagan wants at the right time. A geopolitical report talking about commies in Nicaragua, and the need. His real function is very political. And look, I didn't say anything about the commission for the first couple of months on the grounds you never know. But it's clear. I mean, there's no attempt to run a serious investigation. He's in the press every day. He spends 6 days seeing 6 countries in Central America with a news conference every day, and visiting the leader of the Contras, the rebel forces, the CIA-paid rebel forces against the Nicaraguan government. If he'd gone down and quiet, if he'd had quiet meetings and never gone public and had serious long visits in camera to these countries, maybe something would have emerged. But I think at this point, as of a few months ago, you're exactly right what his function is. And he's probably got a chance to be Secretary of State in the second term. And here I am sitting here. I'm a guy that my book has sold, 150, 60, 70,000 copies here, and bestseller really literally right now in Australia and Canada and England. And if he'd been a lawyer after a book like mine, he would have been able to double his hourly fee, I think. And that's the impact you have. And it's a little less than it should be, I think. But what do you do? We have some problems. Let's do 2 more.
Mr. Hersh?
Just you got, yeah. Yes, sir.
This is about your book, The Price of Power. I think a few loose statements spoils the whole book. It's about, at least I come from India, and you mentioned something about the former Prime Minister alleged that he's a CIA agent.
I didn't say that. I said he was paid $20,000 a year by the CIA to give information.
Okay, like that is a CIA agent, according to me.
Anyway,
this charge is so ridiculous, at least to the people in India, that even the communists who hate Morarji Desai don't agree with it. And as a result, your book is not seriously taken anymore, in spite of it being a good book. Did you really pick this up on the grapevine, or did you substantiate it? Or do you think it's true?
Yes.
You do?
I know it's true.
A Prime Minister of India is working for the CIA for $20,000.
He has sued me for $50 million, and the case is being litigated in a federal court in Chicago. It raises some interesting issues because one of the issues is confidential sources, but nonetheless, there's no question that if push comes to shove, I just don't want to be in a position to do it to him. I go back. Look, you don't write this in a book without reviewing it very carefully. I had 3 different sets of lawyers. Look, we're also anticipating. We had to anticipate a lawsuit from Kissinger, and which he talked about, but has not filed yet, and he has plenty of time. You don't write something like this, which exposes yourself to 2 problems. One of them, of course, is an obvious counter suit by him, and the other one is, at the time we wrote it, there's a law, and there still is a law, naming a government agents. The government has passed a law that has not been adjudicated by the Supreme Court yet or upheld. The law simply says that you cannot name a CIA operative. If he's still alive, foreign country, all these really very much unconstitutional stuff. But we are certainly flying into the teeth of that law. So all I can say is that I don't think the money was terribly important. It went to his political party. He probably didn't even know about it or see it, but that was the quid pro quo that the government set up in its books. There's no question that the Psy was bagging it for us. But, as you know, the Indian government's been terribly penetrated by the CIA. You will concede that, do you not? There's been much written about that. John Kenneth Gilbert has said as much in one of his memoirs that there was CIA
Well,
operatives.
he alleged about Mrs. Gandhi, which again people find hard to. Maybe she received money, but people find it hard to believe that she acted as an agent of the CIA.
One of the things about reporters is we're always writing things that people find hard to believe. I'm sorry. Suffice to say that I'm all for the whole process of litigation and libel. I accept the responsibility. I'm paying my fees. I'm not trying to duck it, and we're not settling the case. Be no settlement. And I just hope he withdraws before he has to get, embarrassed. Let's do one last question.
Okay, one last question. That's it, folks. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, you said at the end of your speech you think we need to pay more attention to the character of the people we elect. How are we going to find out what the character of the people we elect is? How can we get adequate information on that when politics is so concerned with images of candidates and everything, and when the press doesn't really get all information?
Oh, no, it gets it. It doesn't tell it. Go back and read Hunter Thompson. One of the things about Hunter Thompson's book for me used to be that here I am in the New York Times, I'm busy worrying about facts, and Hunter doesn't care that much about facts, but he tells more truth in his books than me with all my facts. So we do have a real problem in terms of truth-telling. And don't think the press doesn't know about the character of the men they're covering. They do. And I think one of the things we should do is try and understand that perhaps it's more important for us to write a little bit more about, I'm not talking about gossip. I'm talking about the way people operate and what kind of men they are. I suggest that's as valid as as what they say at any particular speech or any particular day. I would like to see more reporting that dealt less with 1,000 words of summarizing a speech that the reporter got at 5 o'clock as a handout and filed immediately to be free for the night while on the road. Rather than, I'd like to see more about if I were editor of the World, I would want more things on how they operate and how they proceed. Anyway, bookstore seller. You're the bookstore man, right? Goodbye. Thank you.
Mr. Hersh, thank you very much for lending us your time.